So welcome back to this part 2 studying tea of colonial America. That is the 18th century and how this little drink caused so much uproar among Americans. And why exactly did they think tea was enough to start a war over? Well, as we all know, of course there was much more to it than that. So follow me as I sip my cup of history, going over the details that led to the American Revolution. The introduction of tea to this country goes back to the 1600s, because it generally marked the beginning en masse of the drinking of tea in early America. And then came the infamous taxation. All of this goes back to the previous war, what we in this country call the French and Indian War. War, as we know it, is expensive, and back then there was no exception. The French and Indian War was between our American Indians, who were allies with the British colonies themselves, and the French colonists of this area with their Indian allies. They were fighting each other in a bloody war. This war turned out to be a global conflict, what is generally known as the First World War among scholars, because it ended up involving all major powers, especially of the Western world. For more information on this, you can go back to my previous video on George Washington and the Seneca half-king Tanacharison, sometimes called Tanacharison. If you're curious as to how this war started, click that video, it's in the description below. So after the British were successful in this war, they also gained surmountable debt. British Parliament needed help getting their economics running again, so they passed something in this continent called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts passed by the British Parliament in 1767, the war having just ended in 1763. It included a tax on tea among other goods. As many goods were imported into America, this became a bit of a problem. See, this tax specifically was a 3 pence per pound duty. What that means is it raised the expense. One of the revenue-raising measures intended to help pay for the cost of maintaining British troops in the colonies. Therein we have our first and second problem. One, not only was the price of goods going up, but two, there was the presence of British soldiers here. Previously, this had been a very welcomed thing, because living on the frontier, as it were, among hostile Indian nations who were not only fighting amongst each other, but also raiding and pillaging colonists coming to live into the area, British soldiers were meant to be the #1 main defense, along with American militia. However, here is the problem. It went from protecting the locals and the citizens to enforcing British law that the Americans en masse did not agree with. So while the Townshend Acts were revenue-raising measures to pay for the cost of maintaining British troops in the colonies, it also was meant to assert British authority. While some of the Townshend Acts were later repealed, the tax on tea remained, contributing to colonial resentment and ultimately playing in the role of the Boston Tea Party. The big problem here is the Americans felt they did not get a say in it one way or another. They had not voted on this being a thing, and their representatives, well, there were none. They didn't have any representatives over in Parliament. So what was meant to be an act of peace ended up being an act against its very own citizens. Ended up being a way for that government far across the sea to enact its policies against a people who were not represented. See, British politics is actually quite genius. It is via representation. Well, Americans had representations in their local governments here, but they did not have representation overseas where these taxes were coming from. It is estimated that the colonies were a tremendous purse to the Kingdom of Britain. The very first British colony of Jamestown established this way before in 1607. It was established solely for the purpose of making money, to then send back to Britain, which helped their global economy. This time in Jamestown, it was also when the first American self-government was established, called the Virginia House of Burgesses. Skip ahead over a century and a half. Other colonies would evolve and become states, and these states also had their own governments. And now all of them were taxed for tea. But make no mistake, many, many other things were taxed. Everything from paper to textiles. When you realize how many important things relied on paper, like legal documents, journals, newspapers, books, and even marriage licenses, that became a bit of a stretch. Again, underlying all of this taxation was the fact that Americans didn't have a say in it at all. They did not elect their parliament overseas. They only elected their local government here on this continent. Keep that in mind as the story evolves. So not only were prices on everything going up, but you and your people, including your own self-government, had absolutely no say in the matter. It's one thing if the Americans' own representatives were doing this, but they were not. This was coming from Parliament overseas, where the Americans had absolutely no representatives to speak for them, i.e., taxation without representation. Such anger in the colonies could not go on deaf ears for long, and the English Parliament did try to remove these taxes a couple times to appease their American colonists, which they did. But unfortunately, this would not last for long, and the taxes would be reinstated, sometimes in different ways, without a vote from the Americans themselves who would get taxed. When you earned money, especially back in the 18th century, where a little bit of money went an even longer way, you didn't really want your money going somewhere else without your approval, especially an ocean away. For a government and land you've been relatively detached from for a very long time. See, remember, ever since Virginia, these states had had their own self-governments. And Americans were running themselves very well here in this country, even making many, many Indian allies that became their own global economy. For what's feeling more and more like a distant government, to have no representatives of your own speaking for you, this became more and more apparent that maybe America wasn't being treated like British citizens. And I don't know if you've studied the history of Britain, going back to concepts like the Magna Carta, when British people feel their rights being stripped away, they don't get very happy. And therefore, Americans were no exception. It was not uncommon for a British people to get angry with their own government. And remember, at that point, people here in the colonies considered themselves still British citizens. For this reason, actually, many people in Britain actually sympathized with the colonists. By that same token, some people here said we should be loyal to the British government no matter what. However many times Americans kept trying to appease their British authority, it seemed to fall more and more on deaf ears. And since we were a massive self-running economy, this did not bode well. Suddenly, the British soldiers who were meant to be their civil servants ended up going more and more against the citizens' wishes and more with what their government was telling them to do. This was to be a force and presence, forcing unwanted laws that went against the well-being of its citizens. Even men like George Washington were still slow to get outraged. Many colonists, particularly where the taxation was high, were feeling the sting. Massachusetts, and Bostonians in particular, became more and more peeved with the presence of redcoats in their city, and these laws that they felt should not have been forced upon them. More and more redcoats would be showing up in cities, parading grounds where they feared the colonists would revolt. Their very presence alone was meant to strike fear and also remind the more independently minded British subjects that their government, and not the will of the citizens, was in charge. British powers began cracking down on any other trade that took place in America within her colonies. Trademen, including John Hancock, found themselves having to go underground to keep their businesses moving. So this also hurt many people whose only means of trade and business was made possible by not having British overreach. British overreach ended up hurting many Americans' businesses. Between taxing them without representation, and the British soldiers treating the citizens not like citizens, and putting measures in motion that hurt American businesses, you can imagine where this anger came from. And this very concept is what birthed all the ideas of independence for the 18th century. It is here the seeds of American independence and independent thinking began. Well, tea continued to be an easily taxed item since it was used so much and so often. Even with some taxes being revoked, tea continued to be a very easily taxed item because it was used so much by so many Americans. Something called the Tea Act gave the British East India Company, who was an economic agent for Britain, exclusive rights to sell tea in their colonies. This means that any other company trying to sell tea to the colonies would not succeed. Basically, the East India Company had a monopoly on tea. This was the nail in the coffin for some, and fueled the citizens' outrage even more. Tea, which was often shipped in large quantities, that were wrapped in cloth and could weigh up to 100 pounds, also just happened to be a commodity that was a bit more impactful when thrown overboard into the Boston Harbor. The idea of a republic was becoming more and more appealing to Americans. Because remember, having a republic means having representatives in your stead carry out the wishes of the majority of citizens, where representation would be king, and the people reserved the right to argue for their own decisions. Where the masses now had a voice to rule themselves and allow their own economies to flourish. Where the idea of a republic and the right to run your own economy was the desire, not just a simple cup of tea. Thank you so much for joining me as I discover all the historic occurrences leading to our American Revolution. So stay tuned until next time, enjoy a cup of tea as I will, and let's explore history all the way to the end of the revolution. Huzzah and cheers! Until next time.